In 2015, porn studio Evil Angel shared that trans scenes were their most profitable genre by far, sold at a price premium.
Once I was a girl named Susan, and now I'm a guy named Buck.
And from Pornhub's inception to 2025, lesbian has been the #1 most viewed category each year. Behind those soaring categories are cis straight men, selling lesbian and trans sex back to itself as a fetish built for their pleasure. And that raises a deeper mystery. If queer adult entertainment is so profitable, why aren't queer people the ones getting rich? Gay men have been making erotic media for themselves since the 1950s, distributed through their own sexual networks, while lesbian adult content didn't make its debut until 1984. And even when lesbians built an industry of their own, many of them lost money, while male-run studios cashed in on the fantasy. The answer takes us into a collision between capitalism, censorship, feminist politics, and one of the biggest civil wars in queer history, the feminist sex wars.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Queer Collective podcast. I'm your host, Carbon.
I'm Emily.
And I'm Maggie.
And welcome to the show. And this episode is sponsored by Field, sponsored by Tomboy X, and sponsored by Beducated. Thank you so much to our sponsors, but more on them later. And our guest today is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, whose area of focus is adult entertainment platforms and how they shape the adult industry today, Maggie MacDonald. We also chat with Val Webber virtually, who is a postdoctoral fellow at SHAG and has 15 plus years experience in various areas of the adult industry.
In reference to adult entertainment, what's something that lesbian and trans people have in common?
They're the most profitable porn categories.
Certainly sought after.
Sought after.
Yeah.
Very fetishized, I would say, by the adult entertainment industry. And it's very much by an industry that's dominated by cis men. According to Sophie Pizzuto and Lynn Camella, the modern trans adult entertainment market was built less through queer liberation than through heterosexual niche capitalism. The genre mainly centers trans feminine folks and frames them as, quote, impossible women, who is surgically created to fit women's beauty standards with the, quote, shock and taboo of male genitalia. This genre features humiliation tropes, degrading language, fetishization, and positions the act of sleeping with a trans woman as a shameful secret. How do we feel like centering the male gaze in this dynamic kind of, I don't know, has real world impacts?
In some ways, I think we're out here trying to queer the male gaze through trans porn. There've been some interesting studies done talking to cis viewers of trans porn, where cis men, they often are seeking or are wanting to see themselves in the sort of identity or in the body of the trans person in the porn.
Interesting.
Yeah, and a lot of like MTF trans people are not actually interested in anything having to do with dick play. Like that is for very obvious reasons something that they do not want. But there's a lot of fantasy built up around the presence of male genitalia in that scene. Absolutely. And about the idea of like the fantasy of a cis man being penetrated by a beautiful woman.
Do all like men just low-key want to get pegged, or?
I mean, I think it would be healthy for them.
Maggie, what's your professional opinion here?
Yeah, I think everyone. Yeah. It's a great break the wall moment. Yeah. I think that one of the big dangers actually when it comes to talking about pornography or sexual inclinations is to try and pretend that it's homogenous. This happens with women's interests in porn too. Yeah. Like the three of us in this room, I'm sure we all have radically different perversions and niche sexual interests.
Surely,
right?
perversions,
yes. Yeah, absolutely.
We can talk about them later off camera.
Absolutely, absolutely. The same danger that we run into with talking about trans people and their best interests in porn, or talking about lesbians' best interests in porn, or how to make porn ethical or appealing, is that it's not flat as that. Right, porn is really troubling. Porn is really complicated, and often the things that people seek out and that turn them on don't map very cleanly onto things like our orientations or our actual real world sexual inclinations.
Yes.
They're about exploring these kind of transgressive fantasy boundaries. And I think trans porn is definitely something that sits at the forefront of that, because it's this opportunity to play with the boundaries of what society considers permissible and what's forbidden, and what, you can explore acts or identities as a cis person. It maybe makes you feel like you can access a little window of that. But it's voyeuristic. pornography is voyeuristic by default, though, to some extent.
It's true.
So the initial prompt you had of what do these two demographics have in common in porn, at least from where my research sits, it's that they kind of fall through the cracks with certain algorithmic recommendation systems. I am speaking specifically of when you go to tube sites or camming sites, like the really major streaming sites for porn on the web today. You are inundated with just a wall of content, right? It's just a cascade of little thumbnails, usually very provocative titles. They're often auto-playing. Like, it is truly sensory overload.
And so much incest for some reason.
Absolutely. Yeah. Listen, we can talk about that. I love talking about that.
It's off topic, but
nothing's off limits here today. But it creates a system where, at the scale of the way that these sites are operating, with often millions of people going to this landing page a day, it's not that everyone is going in with a well-curated idea of exactly what types of creators they're looking for, exactly what kind of acts or scenes they're looking for. A lot of people are encountering websites like Pornhub kind of naively, right? They walk in and they just see what is fed to them. And it creates these feedback loops where what's popular and what's on the front page is then being viewed exponentially more, and content that's similar to it in terms of categorization and recommendation just kind of gets swept upwards, funneled upwards in this really interesting amplification spiral.
And you'd say that might be what's happening with lesbian porn specifically, of it constantly being the number one ranked category.
We see it with all sorts of different tropes in porn. You see it for better or for worse. You see it with racialized tropes in porn. You see it with certain acts, and even the type of lesbian porn you're seeing isn't like, it's not like soft butch lesbian porn on the main page of Pornhub, right? You're seeing a very particular type of glamorized like permutation of two very kind of particular looking people over and over and over again. And you see this with racial configurations. If you type in the term interracial, you're not getting like a Polish woman and a Malaysian man. Like, that's not the interracial that they're indicating, right? And it's the same thing with lesbian. You're not seeing like the vast range of the lesbian experience or the vast range of trans representation. You're seeing like a very kind of particular lowest common denominator.
Two very polished porn stars that are typically feminine.
Absolutely. Val and I are both on Pornhub's board.
You're on the board?
Yeah.
How do you get on such a board?
They recruited us. We're the only two academics on the board.
Whoa, that's pretty sick.
A lot of the work that we do there is that we get to kind of do bespoke research projects. Our first major project together was talking to Pornhub about the language that's used to describe demographics like trans people and how they can do some shifts. We talked to a lot of trans performers about this.
What was that language shift? Like the specific word changes, would you say?
I'll try to avoid using the terms because it wasn't limited exclusively to trans performers. It was also a lot to do with racialized language.
Right.
You ultimately have all these content creators who are like also very complicated people who live these full lives, and often, if they're highly visible in the nature of the creator economy now, they're often also like advocates in their various communities. You get people who are like trans community organizers who also make their bread and butter like via OnlyFans and via Pornhub. And they're saying, in the streets, I'm out here campaigning for, to prevent like anti-trans healthcare bills. And then I have to turn around and tag all of my content with derogatory language.
Yeah, painful.
Ooh.
Right. Because that's what people are searching.
Identity intersection problem where
like that's how people know how to search you, and that's how your content's getting found.
Exactly. So you really have to like get in bed with the devil, and the devil is the algorithm, because it means that these are really savvy. Porn creators are really technologically and really politically savvy.
Well, now you're an entrepreneur. You're like a social media manager. You're so many different things.
Truly. It's almost like the way that when people think of porn star or porn performer, I think they still have this very antiquated like 1990s studio Jenna Jameson idea of what that looks like. And no, they're a lot more like the Hadids nowadays. They're a lot more like Charlie D'Amelio's or whatever. I've said that wrong. I am not a content creator scholar, but they have to do a lot of the same work that I think people in other media industries like podcasting or like video content creation have to do, where they have to follow trends and they track what their audiences are up to, and they're paying very close attention to how their conversion rates from different platforms are working. Of course, this means that they're extremely aware of what works and what doesn't. And so you get these creators who might feel a sense of frustration with having to tag something with language that is a little bit outdated, to put it kindly.
So what was the solution to that?
Well, because they also recognize that they can't just stop. Yeah. You can't just stop using those terms because, you know, it would be great if everyone was extremely sensitive in the nomenclature they're using on these sites, but your average person going to look at a porn video that these creators are appearing in are not. They're not educated in that way. Okay. And so if you lose like the bulk of your audience overnight because you stop using hashtags, either because you opt out or because the site that you're on has decided to cut that out, it doesn't matter. Either way, it makes you invisible. Either way, you end up being the one who's punished because suddenly your income takes the hit.
Also, I would say probably when you go to these sites, when you go to like OF or I think most people's intentions is like I can type whatever I want. I can be as raunchy as I want. I don't have to like be polite about what my desire is right now in terms of like what I'm viewing, and to not feel bad about it because it's like the Wild West and anything goes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the problem with that though becomes for a lot of cis people, this is their only encounter with a trans person, and then that starts to frame their entire narrative of them.
Well,
is like
sure.
this like very hypersexualized, objectified version.
Well, you'd have to like be very aware. You'd have to be aware of like porn is not reality.
But not everyone is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think I used to read Dan Savage's articles. He has this great parallel he draws where he says, like, we don't teach young people how to drive cars by just letting them have at the Grand Theft Auto series.
Right.
But we sort of do treat sexual development and engagement with sexual reality like that. There isn't, you know, shout out to one of your sponsors, Beducation.
Beducated.
Yeah, there's no standardized like sex education, consent education, pleasure education.
I've been masturbating the same way since high school, and I'm gonna be so real, it is getting a little bit boring. But talking to you, Maggie, I am realizing that there's actually so much space for like play and creativity within solo pleasure that I'm like have yet to even access. But I just actually don't even know where to start.
Let's go 2026 goon goals.
Yeah. Actually, though.
Solo pleasure and sex are skills that can be learned, they can be practiced, they can be mastered. And honestly, if you really want to level up your solo pleasure game, you should check out Beducated, which is the sponsor of today's video. Beducated is an incredible sex education platform that I stumbled upon recently that has changed the game for me. The gooning games, the pleasure games are off the charts. There couldn't be a better time because May is International Masturbation Month, and Beducated just launched their Go Touch Yourself campaign.
I love that my birth month is also masturbation month. It feels quite fitting.
It is fitting. But seriously, you can celebrate both Taurus season and masturbation month by learning new techniques for out-of-this-world pleasure on Beducated. They have over 150 online courses created by the world's top experts. I'm talking guided masturbation, a guide to sex toys for vulva owners, male multiple orgasms, and so much more.
Yeah, I'm committed. Genuinely, this is my 2026 goal, and I will be updating everyone on my progress on this podcast. So if you want to join me in a month-long goon sesh, click the link in the description to get started.
Absolutely. Click the link. The platform is super user-friendly and engaging. It all starts with a quiz to help personalize your experience, and then you'll gain access to everything from self-pleasure to kink, all in engaging formats like video tutorials, practical exercises, all in one place.
That's Beducated, spelled Beducated. Click our personalized link in the description to get started.
Not because the industry wants this to be the burden of the adult industry, but it ends up becoming the de facto way to communicate sexual knowledge and to like even explore the self, like self-discovery, inquiry, whatever. So it is important. There's a responsibility there. So what we see is these creators who are feeling this tension, these users who don't know any better. And what we ended up recommending to slowly iterate like system design changes so that these words can still be searched for, they will still return the results, but it'll be almost like a slow retraining process where
so
they get the results, but then it'll maybe note at the top, did you mean these terms, transgender? Did you
good.
mean like FTM? Did you mean, so it sort of doesn't a behavioral correction thing.
That's good.
Platforms do this all the time. This is
Yeah.
like why this, when you log on to, you know, a Meta platform or TikTok, it feels like seamless design. They invest a huge amount of money into this kind of user experience.
Yeah.
Right.
And it can achieve a lot. Like small tweaks in design can really transform the type of content that you're seeing, the type of things that you're more likely to look for or search for, the way that you'll follow up. Today, if you go to look for a variety of terms, it sort of just gently course corrects while still providing you the content that was clearly intended for. And then over time, it's meant to be almost like a whole system retraining.
Full
That's awesome.
change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's really good to hear.
Yeah.
Trans performers have always had a presence in erotica and adult entertainment, but never in ownership positions until the mid-2000s to 2010s. And similarly, lesbian adult entertainment is also a very recent history. Lesbian imagery is ancient. However, lesbian porn made by and for lesbians is relatively recent. We're talking the 1980s. So lesbian erotica dates all the way back to the classical world, from the depictions of women manually stimulating another woman on a 6th century BC vase, from ancient Greece to the erotic frescoes of Pompeii.
Right. Pompeii.
Yeah, like the volcano.
Lesbian stuff was okay there, right?
So here's the catch. Almost all surviving evidence was produced, recorded, interpreted, or commissioned by men. Meaning these likely weren't identity portraits of lesbians, but the erotic curiosities of men.
Or maybe they saw it.
Maybe, and I'm pretty sure if I'm remembering correctly, the one from Pompeii that you're remembering from the lesbian sex history was like, don't do this.
It was also
It was like, this is bad. It was like a scale
lesbian
of,
stuff is bad.
Yeah, it was
right.
like on a scale of good to bad. It was
Right.
like on the bad
Also,
side.
men getting penetrated was very bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was dirty.
It's all filthy. Isn't
It's
it?
all
It's
filthy.
just filthy.
What counts as lesbian adult entertainment and who gets to decide that? Like, is it defined by who makes it, who watches
boy.
it, the identities of the performers, or the fantasies that it enables?
On some level, it's got to be a little bit of all of the above. Like, I don't think it ever boils down to, is it like good lesbian porn if a lesbian woman helmed it?
Right.
You know, is it good if the working conditions weren't great? Is it good if it is still reductive and stereotypical? Or like, can it be just truly really good, you know, lesbian media if it is produced by like a cis man where this is not in his realm of straight desire at all?
I think the question I'm asking though is like, when does like the history of lesbian adult entertainment start? It's been seen in imagery since like ancient civilizations, right? Like we've seen these lesbian imagery, and we've seen imagery of trans folks as well. But for example, Amelia Ziv, who's a senior lecturer for the gender studies program at Ben Gurion University, says, for me, lesbian adult entertainment is entertainment produced by lesbians for lesbians. It's not just adult entertainment with lesbian content and lesbian themes. So that would make it a very short history. I would start in the mid-1980s with lesbian sex magazines. In Val's work specifically, who we're going to hear from later in this episode, they kind of differentiate as like girl on girl versus lesbian.
Girl on girl, I think, was always intended to say, like, we're not saying these are lesbians. We're not trying to make any claim on who these characters are outside of this moment. We're just describing that there's no dick in this scene. And yes, it's a very, like, the term is very cis-centric, right? I think, again, maybe people are using it in different ways now, but at the time that I was most active, you know, girl on girl really meant like two cis presenting women together. And that lesbian porn, the term was sort of reserved for, made by, and for the people in the content identified to some degree with the term lesbian, and the people maybe directing, if not owning, the content, and to some degree, the intended audience. But intended audience and actual audience, there's no way to control for that.
The Pornhub algorithm is still calling it lesbian, you know, even when it's like,
Okay.
Actually, walking over here today, I was like, what's going on with the Pornhub lesbian category? And I saw that if you pull it up, this as of today, they actually have switched it over into sapphic beta.
Oh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Google it.
Yeah. Which is so fun because I do feel like sapphic is on the up as the moment.
It's on the up.
Because of non-binary people.
Yes.
It's confusing things.
Yeah.
you know?
Femme non-binary.
Yeah,
Definitely.
it's like everyone's questioning their sexuality, but sapphic feels more open than lesbian, so it's like more inclusive. We chatted virtually with adult entertainment researcher Val Webber, who views a bit of a gray area here. In their research article titled Shades of Gay, Val argues that sex work and adult entertainment itself is performative in nature, but performance is not incompatible with authenticity.
The whole notion of performance versus authenticity is a false dichotomy. There is no real, authentic, true origin of any kind of social activity, and sex is a social activity. There's no way for me to separate out, my quote unquote true desires or the way I would truly engage in a sex act versus how I would perform it. There's always going to be some kind of performance going on. It's just going to shift according to who I'm performing for and why I'm performing it for them, including myself.
I think it's hard to definitively say, here's where it is officially lesbian porn. But I don't want to discredit the creativity and like the trickster nature of like lesbian women who are desiring to see lesbian porn. The first great vampire novel was Carmilla, right? Which is a lesbian vampire novel written by a man. I believe he was an Irish author, but it is extremely sapphic. Yeah. It is obviously not hardcore, but it is about like the longing and desiring between two young women and this kind of forbidden chasm between them. And I feel like I wouldn't want to discredit all of the potential for real lesbian desire in that space, right? Because it's not made by a lesbian woman explicitly for lesbians.
Val said that it was all porn is performative.
Yeah.
It's all porn is performance.
Yeah.
So similar to television, does it need to be like a lesbian playing a lesbian character? I don't think so, as long as their performance is good. Does it make a difference when it's like a lesbian playing a lesbian character? Like when it comes to like television, like it makes me a little bit more giddy, but it's not a necessary thing as long as like I believe them.
A lot of sex is performative, like you were saying. And sometimes it's like the best performance that you're believing that feels real to you. It's like that might not be what the performer is like actually feeling inside of them. It's like there's that gap.
Well, all of it is acting as well.
And sometimes like when you're having a really good orgasm, you can be doing that with deadpan, so it's like
deadpan.
It's like, well, sometimes like for some people, like for some people it's like what you think, I don't know, like even when you're having just sex with your partner, it's like you're putting on a performance to give them visual cues. Right? Of like, you're doing this well, like keep going. And it's like, would you do that if you were just masturbating by yourself? Maybe not, Like some of it might be real, some of it not, but it's like all sex has an element of performance to it in some ways, right? And it's open to another person's interpretation of how real that is,
And this is where we get into, man, this is going to get sticky. Like all things are performance in human socialization. Right?
Yeah.
This is where we get into classic sociological theory, like Irving Goffman and the performance of the self in your everyday life. Like your gender is
real?
a performance. Yeah. When it comes to media representation, there's a danger of wanting things to be perfect, right? Of wanting like perfect kind of representation and perfect productions. But one of the messy things about pornography is it is transgressive and it is kind of voyeuristic and it is often exaggerated and it is messy. Like, and very often that means that the things that we're desiring to see in our porn are not even necessarily things we would be desiring in real life.
Yeah.
So it also begs the question of like,
I agree.
is the only way to be a good lesbian watching good lesbian porn to like, or can they not like watch cis pornography?
Quite on the contrary, a lot of lesbians watch gay porn.
Absolutely.
Is it actually what we want in reality? Right. No, but we seek it visually, in a voyeuristic way for whatever psychology thing that I don't know.
There's some good reasons behind that, and part of it really does boil down to ideally there would be proportional representation. Like you would have as many, lesbian protagonists on CSI spinoffs as anyone else, right? But that's not the media ecosystem we live in. The media ecosystem we live in rewards like masculine men. You're seeing these figures who get to live these like rich, fleshed out media lives. And so of course you project yourself into them. You identify and you affiliate with them more. You can see yourself in their stories. It's harder for that to run downstream. Like it is obviously possible, like for cis straight men who watch a lot of TV to elevate themselves, but it is not as downstream for them to say, I really, resonate with middle-aged white women as protagonists, because they're not seeing qualities that they relate to and emulate and want it is like desirable qualities in a character as often. They're not saturated in it the way we're saturated in it, right?
Yeah, I researched this a bit. I think it was for a previous episode, but part of it was like lesbians having ethical concerns about, is the woman in the video enjoying herself? And then with men, like gay porn, whatever, it looks like both of them are thoroughly enjoying themselves more, and they feel like they can trust it more. Right. So, I don't know, which is, I feel like a lot of...
But also, I don't care. So like,
if
I don't care. I don't care if you're not like enjoying yourself that much. Like, it's not a concern for me.
The first homosexual adult entertainment video came a whopping 56 years before the first lesbian adult video. That's like a really big gap.
That's a huge gap.
Yeah. So
gaps need to be filled.
Yeah.
Your research paper title is coming along nicely.
Some holes that need filling. The first film was called The Surprise of a Night. It was depicting exclusively homosexual sex, and it came out in 1929 in the US, but it didn't have like any names associated with it. It was kind of like distributed anonymously. How do you guys imagine people would consume porn in 1929? Do you know?
1929. Wasn't it the big roles, or
like think about it though? Like, do you think how would you watch porn?
The big rolls.
What would you do with it?
You put it in your big roll thing. The roll holder.
And then you fire up the old horse. Somehow. One of the biggest shifts we see from like about 100 years ago to now is that porn watching and just media consumption generally used to be a far more social experience. Far more social.
It was a group activity.
The family would gather around, get their popcorn.
Fire up the old horse. It was one of the reasons that the term stag film is how we describe pornographic film of that era, is that it would be watched by these groups of men, mostly men, who would be embarking on a social outing. They would be going to a theater, going to a private space to watch this kind
their
of
porn together.
Because like no one had a VCR.
Would they have like jerk circles, or like what would happen?
I like to think so. I like to think so. I'm looking forward to reading whatever research there is on that after this. But it often was this like deeply homosocial activity, right? Where it is loaded now, but it was like locker room behavior, where it became a space for men to be present with and like socialize with and impress and like have fun with other men.
Kind of like dolphins do.
Just like dolphins. Much as dolphins do.
Lots of dolphin activity.
Today, there's been this massive shift where, it really began. It's like our sphere of watching is growing more and more atomized, more and more isolated from one another, more and more atomized. Because then we moved from theaters and films being in these kind of shared spaces to them being VCRs and TVs in living rooms. Like things could be broadcast, you could have.
And now just on your little phone.
Right. And then it became the family computer in the next room.
Together.
Yeah. We're really collective lesbian gooning movement starts now. Like, let's go.
Well, to get your hands on one of these rolls back in the day, it would have been very difficult, I'd imagine.
I have a great idea for an event. No, I'm just kidding.
Come together. But it was extremely social, and there's this idea now that people consuming porn, obviously the actual viewing experience is often very disembodied from other people, which is why you see the rise in popularity of movements like gooning. Like the idea that people are admitting it is somewhat social to want to have these sexual experiences and recognize that other people are having them. Why not together? But you're not really alone. You're watching these things on devices that feel like you're in a very isolated position, but every single thing you do is, like, by virtue of the sites that you're on, is being tracked and monitored. it's not that anyone actually cares what you are watching or what I'm watching, but they care about crowd behavior. They care about kind of collective movement. You are dipping into the same library, the same like pool and catalog that every other viewer is dipping
doing
into.
it all from your homes instead of in a jerk circle like God intended.
Yeah. With the homies. Like just getting together with 18 of your closest friends to watch, what was the first video?
Oh, Surprise of a Night.
Surprise of a Night.
Where did gooning even come from? And what does it mean? Will you explain it for the people who aren't on Twitter?
Oh, yeah.
Or on X?
I think most people are
It just means like you're like masturbating a lot, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it means that like the act of, in a lot of ways, I think the philosophy of gooning, I'm never going to have a career in politics.
Love that you said that.
Is one where it's not just about getting a task done and about like getting it over with. It's almost like taking joy in this kind of carnal moment.
So it's the journey of masturbation.
Libidinal act, how your body is responding. It's I am very pro gooner. Get on with it. Because I think it is it's playful and it's sort of silly. And it's a pushback against this puritanical idea that even like sex should be kind of sterile and it should just be like gotten over with quickly and it's shameful and it should be sanitized. And I think that's actually at odds with what a lot of people find moving sexually.
Oh, like what they search for as well.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why what people perform as their preferences and as their orientations is often not aligned with what their sexual and pornographic fantasies are.
Right.
Because we all wear many hats in our lives, right?
Yeah.
The horny hat is just one.
So I kind of want to talk about one of the many reasons of why women weren't able to make lesbian adult entertainment for women before the 1980s. I think one piece of it is, for the most part, they weren't really in these rooms watching the porn with men. Like it seems like it was mainly like it was a boys' club for a lot of the time.
Well, it would be like women weren't allowed to be sexual. They were just expected to have sex with like the man, the husband, the whatever.
I will say it's a bit of a misconception that they didn't consume any erotic materials. It was more just done like amongst like groups of couples or like artistic circles. Like it would be more alternative women who would be doing this.
There's some interesting context around this too, right?
Please, yeah.
Where in the mid-war period, when there was just, massive economic and like sort of cultural depression that had hit all of North America, you get a lot of men who had been shipped off to war effectively.
Of the Second World War?
First World War.
Okay.
But like the interwar period, who come back very disenfranchised. Like they often come back kind of broken people, not facing the social rewards that they maybe have expected after like a run of service. And
after serving your country.
Right. Well, and in Canada anyways, there was like a lot more kind of vagrancy and like petty crime and this kind of like train hopping, like vagrant mobile movement. But it created this social problem, right? Prior to this, though, the idea of homosexuality is a relatively new one. It is not as old as people assume it is. Yeah. The idea of like men loving men, women loving women, like queer sex acts, eternal, spans as long as we can record. The idea of homosexuality is like a stable identity construct.
Like medicalized kind of. Yeah.
That's very much only about 100 years old. Yeah. And in Canada, one of the records we have of this happening was looking at medicalization and court histories from this era, right? Like the 1920s, the 1930s, because it began to link homosexuality with petty crime.
Interesting.
Right? We have this burgeoning field of psychiatry, like the profession of psychology and psychiatry is relatively new at the time. It's kind of trying to establish itself with legitimacy, linking itself to other major legacy institutions like the courts. And so doing things like psychiatric assessments of men who had, say, committed a little blowjob and a little shoplifting, a little bit of petty crime here and there. These things began to be linked very closely in like public opinion and as a matter of record.
You were a sexual deviant.
Absolutely. Yeah. Deviancy and homosexuality became very closely linked in the media as well. And one of the interesting things about that is prior to this time, we're also seeing print publications start circulating en masse. Like a lot of things are going on all at once. Print media is being circulated nationally. But then you start to see headlines. Say you're a young queer person living on the prairies, but you don't even have language for what has set you apart from your neighbors or from your family. You might know something is up. In many cases, researchers have looked into how we suspect that it was almost in some ways easier to live as a lesbian prior to being identified as a lesbian.
For sure, because you just best friends.
Yeah, you just have a close relationship with Colleen from the next farm over, and no one really asked any questions.
And your roommates,
But then when, headlines start to come out about the homosexual menace and how this is a form of deviancy and you have to like protect your children from this and your families from this, it did a couple of things all at once. It meant that rural queers went, it's not just me. This is a thing.
Yeah.
Like, okay, deviancy, questionable, but it began to create this sort of signposting where then people could gather, but it also put a target on their backs, right? So behaviors that used to just be sort of easy to dismiss or overlook suddenly became like targets of concern. And you also see this queer migration into the cities at this point where people are then looking for their people. So we see movements into city centers like Toronto and Vancouver really start to happen.
Yeah, and the early
1930s,
homophile
40s.
movement kind of begins around your criminalization because it allows people a reason to like gather together.
Yeah, and all of this because, a lady living on the prairies reads a pulp novel about like the lesbian threat, like how it's a menace and it'll turn your daughters and your sisters. And she's like, that sounds great. I'm moving to Toronto.
Another piece that kept women away from creating their own adult entertainment was censorship and obscenity laws. Obscenity laws were the legal weapon used to hold back queer adult entertainment for decades. Framed as protections for public morality, they gave governments a vague excuse to censor anything quote-unquote deviant they found threatening. Adult entertainment, sex work, women's autonomy, queer visibility, and any challenge to Christian sexual norms. Once something was labeled obscene, it could be banned, seized, or destroyed. By the 1940s and 50s, these laws were no longer just suppressing dirty books. They were suppressing queer existence itself. Early queer newsletters were censored, mailed in secrets, and their writers were surveilled by like the FBI and USPS. Like it was like really, you were being watched. And even the makers of like the first queer magazine talk about like being surveilled by the FBI. Like it was a very intense thing to be doing to make queer porn. There's one as late as 1992 that was fought by Glad Day Bookshop, which is the oldest bookshop in the world, and it's here in Toronto. John Sykes talks about how the court case cost him equivalent of what would be $250,000 today. And I reached out to him to comment on this, but he said it was just like too painful to even talk about. So it's like they did something that was really big for the community and like chipping away at these legal rights, but it's like comes at a huge personal cost as well.
The court decision you're referring to, it's the Butler decision, and it really set this groundwork that we see a version of, I think, a phrase that is very renowned, especially in the US, is that I know it when I see it. Justice Potter Stewart, how he described pornography, I'll know it when I see it. But the problem is that is kind of the legal basis for a lot of descriptions of obscenity and pornography.
Yeah, and the vagueness is kind of the problem too. It's like that's why it allowed them to kind of just make these broad sweeping decisions.
Definitely, so much room for interpretation. One of my favorite quotes about pornography is by a historian named Walter Kendrick, and he says, pornography names more of an argument than it does an actual thing. It's about the boundaries of where that argument shifts, right? And in Canada, we have this premise of obscenity since 92 based on community guidelines, which is effectively, does something that is an explicit sexual depiction have any redeeming social or moral or political value? But the people who get to make those decisions, the idea that it represents, what the community's guidelines are, what the community's needs are, it's often something that happens behind closed doors, and it's often quite banal. And it has ripple effects that we see even today, where when it comes to what's considered objectionable online, like what can be censored, it often is closer to queer content. Something like a body part or something maybe sexually suggestive happening when it is a white, thin, able-bodied, cis, often profitable, often already highly visible person. Usually that is more likely to pass muster.
It's more palatable.
Yeah, but like a fat trans Black activist trying to pull off the same type of, let's say, like revealing posture or language is significantly more likely to be censored and shadow banned and deplatformed and demonetized. And it's because it's considered objectionable. But that is a moving target, which is also why, what is pornography is such a strange question that we're going to be asking for a million years to come. There's this double-edged sword ultimately that comes with visibility, where, starting in the 1920s through up to 1992 to today, being visible also makes you visible. It makes you it puts a target on your back. It helps you find one another, but then it can create a whole bunch of ripple effects of what that visibility means. It's not always, representation is not always universally positive. It can create issues for queer communities. Yeah.
That's a good point.
Absolutely. While the definition of what counts as lesbian adult content is up for debate, I think objectively when something is made by the community that it's trying to serve, it ends up serving its purpose so much better.
Yeah. So lesbian porn is better when made by lesbians.
From my perspective, yes. I think that's like an objective truth. And I think the same goes for underwear as well, which brings us to today's sponsor, Tomboy X. Tomboy X is queer founded, queer run, and queer designed.
And believe me, you can tell. Plus, I have never come across a queer-owned brand with this many options. I'm talking 12 different silhouettes in 3 different fabrics. And they have everything from thongs to boy shorts to 9-inch briefs.
With Tomboy X, there are no sacrifices. We both got exactly what we were looking for, and it's giving gender euphoria. I'm going to be so honest. I just wore it to the gym.
And not only that, they design with the entire community in mind. Stocking sizes extra small through 6X.
And you can feel confident whether you're wearing their premium underwear, bras, swim, or loungewear. Seriously, so many options.
When you spend money with Tomboy X, you can feel good about it, not only because you're supporting a queer-owned business, which is already great, but because they are B Corp certified, meaning they're standing on business and meeting the highest standard of social and environmental accountability and transparency.
Literally, what more could you ask for?
Stop people pleasing.
Okay.
With Tomboy X, you can ask for more because they have a love at first wear guarantee, meaning that you can rest assured that if these aren't the most comfortable underwear that you've ever worn, they'll either get you a pair that is or get you your money back. No questions asked.
Oh, hell yeah. So if you're ready to get into the best underwear you've ever owned, use code QUEER15 for 15% off your purchase at checkout. And tell them Queer Collective sent you. You brought up lesbian pulp novels, and I kind of wanted to introduce those because they were a bit of a precursor to like actual like harder core lesbian adult entertainment, I would say. This is like the soft core intro. A Supreme Court ruling that homosexuality was not inherently obscene opened the door for lesbian pulp novels in the 1950s and 60s. So like I was saying, before anything that mentioned homosexuality, it was like, that's obscene, remove it, charged, whatever. But in the 1950s and 60s, it kind of opened the door a little bit. So they were cheap, pocket-sized, softcore romance books sold discreetly on newsstands with titles like That Other Hunger and The Odd Girls. But because of obscenity laws, it wasn't like open playing field totally. Lesbian desire could only be shown if it was punished. So by the final pages, the women had to renounce queerness, lose everything, or die. Those tragic endings were the price of publication, yet despite their shame-filled narratives, the Lesbian Herstory archives still call them survival literature because for many lesbians, they were one of the only places to see themselves at all. And I mean, you were speaking about how important it is, even it's like when you're seeing this narrative of criminalization, you're like, I'm not alone.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, this is still survival literature. Like, it's like, there's other people out there.
Yeah.
You know?
We're all doing crime.
Yeah. Together you do crime. While gay men had been producing and circulating their own erotic magazines for decades, physique magazines in the 1950s, underground photo sets in the 60s, hardcore publications by the 70s, true lesbian adult entertainment was at a standstill. That is, until 1984. Lesbian adult entertainment developed differently than it did for gay men because, like many things in the lesbian community, it was deeply shaped by feminist politics. Very horny.
As one does.
Yeah, very horny. At this moment in history, feminism, especially lesbian feminism, was having a huge infight about sex. So much so that this period was called the sex wars.
We love to do that though, don't we?
Yeah.
Like, men is just like, put it out. It's like, whatever. And then women's like, we're horny, but we want to do it right.
Yeah. What's the ethics of that?
What are the ethics? Let's ask questions. Let's
And
have a
that's why-
yap fest and delay this process for decades.
And that's why I love women, though.
It's like, it's a double-edged sword. It's a pro and a con.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Anti-porn activists had become the dominant voice in the movement. They thought all adult entertainment was inherently misogynistic, and they were being super strict about it. Anthropologist Gail Rubin, among many others, recalls showing up to these organizing meetings and there being no room for conversation, nuance, or definition about what types of adult entertainment they're talking about. Why do you guys think it might be like problematic for feminists to paint all porn as bad? Do you have any thoughts?
Because then, well, I mean, I'm sure you have thoughts, but to me, it feels like then it's like, okay, you're defaulting everything to like probably the male gaze and defaulting to, I don't know, maybe like lessening our sexuality, you know, and like our level of desire and all of these things. And I mean, women also want to be like raunchy and nasty sometimes. So you need to allow space for that to be explored.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we opened the discussion with was what do sort of trans demographics and lesbian demographics have in common with porn?
Callback.
Yeah, and it's this flattening. It's this idea that it's this homogenous category, that it all has to be aligned and it all means one thing and it looks one way. It's this kind of imaginary space that they get. There's this marginalization. Yeah. And I think that women fighting for their, you know, sexual liberation and their agency, it often would kind of fall into a similar category where it's very misguided, but they'd say we need to be completely aligned on this issue.
Right.
And we're aligned against like this patriarchal expression of media. But that flattens what like women want. That flattens desire. That flattens like what representation can do. That flattens the types of pleasure that women can take from pornography.
Yeah.
But so much of the sex wars had to do, they boiled down to that like Robin Morgan phrase, if pornography is the theory, is the practice, where it just flattened all depictions of women having sex in media as somehow being exploitative. And I think that to accept that premise, you'd have to accept that all sexual interaction with men is exploitative. And I think that all of us know that that is not true. It is obviously much, it's a fraught territory, but so much of sex and so much of sexual desire and experience and like self-exploration is so rewarding. And it is like the building blocks that our relationships and our communities are built on, and it's baked into your life in ways that are pleasurable and nice. And the idea that depictions of it are all bad, I think is like self-evidently nonsense. But it was meant to serve a political project.
I think the interesting thing about infighting is like sometimes it's the fuel that creates something really interesting that's about to come out of it. On the other side of the debate, in the 80s, many lesbians viewed sex as liberatory. And here's a clip of Deborah Sundial, who co-founded one of the first lesbian erotic magazines titled On Our Backs.
So here was the early 80s, and a lot had changed, and we were going to come out with a bang, and it was politically motivated. It was about women claiming their power, specifically their sexual power. It's empowering to show the world your sexuality. It's okay. It's beautiful, in fact. In fact, it's creative, it's enlivening, it's inspiring. People thought instead, up until that time, that if you were a sexual being, especially a woman, you were going on the wrong path, the path to hell, the path to, you know, drink and death and a gutter. It was like, no, this is a whole new era.
And I really like that
The
clip.
80s seemed pretty cool.
There was so many social justice movements happening around this time.
Yeah.
It was a very exciting time to be alive. But I mean, one thing they did share, this was like a big panel discussion of all of the people who have created this magazine. And one thing they said is like, we didn't realize it was such an interesting time to be alive while we were doing it. And I think you also probably don't realize how interesting
Of the time it is now.
Exactly, and how many
right.
social justice movements and cool seeds of ideas
True.
you're invested in right now, you know, which
Very
is like a
true.
cool way to think about it.
Because when I think back at it, I'm like 70s
You're like,
seemed pretty
whoa.
cool, 80s seemed pretty cool, and I wasn't around for it. 60s also, late 60s seemed very cool. I like wish I could have, you know, go back. Now I guess it's cool, but like I feel like I won't know that it's cool until later.
Right.
Yeah.
We can only hope that we look back and think, damn,
Yeah.
I was on the right side of history.
I'm actually just so glad that I was born in this time period. I'll be honest. I think I would have been like lobotomized, burned at a stake.
You definitely, because you have a big mouth.
And
you
I can't help
keep
it.
your mouth shut. I feel like I could have gone under the radar.
Yeah, I couldn't have.
No.
I was born in the right era.
Radical ideas like
Yeah.
women enjoy sex.
Yeah, literally. Yeah.
I would have been sneaky about it.
Yeah.
There we go. Different strategies for survival.
For sure. So in that clip, Deborah is really explaining how her and her team viewed female sexuality. And in 1984, they set out to share that message in great opposition to many feminists. On Our Backs magazine editor Susie Bright shared that most feminists at the time spoke about wanting to assassinate them. That was kind of the level.
That's
like it
pretty
was like
damn
it was
extreme.
very heightened, the mood. Yeah. And that was like the majority of feminist viewpoint at the time. They were like really going against the dominant voice.
Well, I mean, we still see this. We see this throughout the course of history, including today. Like, people get death threats all the time.
For sure.
Whenever you have, like, an outspoken opinion.
Yeah. So as you can tell, there were some very strong emotions surrounding adult entertainment and feminism. And what pushed it even further is the magazine's name. On Our Backs was a satirical reference to the feminist newspaper Off Our Backs, which regularly published the work of anti-adult entertainment feminists in the 1980s. So that really stroked the fire.
That's cunty.
Bringing us over to kind of like feminism in adult entertainment, like how do those go together? What might that look like? On Our Backs photographer Morgan Grenwald spoke about creating the genre of feminist foreign. And this is what she said.
We started doing what's now was later called feminist porn. We didn't really have that language for it, but that's what we were doing, feminist porn. And that, you know, the performers or the models were doing what they wanted to do. We were making them comfortable. We weren't directing them, telling them to do this, that, and the other. It was just trying to capture their sexuality and hoping to share it, you know, through the magazine and other means. But now there's a whole genre of feminist porn. I mean, you go around and there's a million feminist porn movies and it's this whole thing. But back then it was just like we were making these dyke porn movies. We didn't realize what we were really starting.
That's pretty badass to be like,
I made a whole genre.
I made a whole genre. Oops.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think are the non-negotiables of like creating feminist porn? Is it still in this form of what Morgan was talking about, or is there like other things that you're like non-negotiables? Like this is what makes something feminist and ethical.
A lot of the work that I do, because my focus in my research is on technology and on labor and commerce. So when I think about porn, I think about it in this kind of weird space of professionalization. Forget about amateur.
Yeah.
It's a professionalization of amateur, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
And if this is a mode of employment or of income, I think the bottom line is that people need to be getting compensated. I think that's what makes something ethical.
For sure.
They need to be appropriately compensated according to the context of what is happening and being accredited properly according to like things like the performance name that they want. How much anonymity do they want? Do they want what kind of pronouns or what kind of depictions or acts or elements are going to be made visible on screen? And are they getting bank for it? And do they have the ability to like revoke that consent at some point? Can they take that video off of the internet? You know, I think that those are some of the key elements to ethical. Some people, of course, are also making pornography not necessarily to profit. There is a huge slew of contributors out there, of content creators who are like not necessarily looking for
Money.
income.
Yeah.
I mean, mostly men, though, ironically.
really?
Mostly men on camming sites who are doing it for pleasure.
For the love of the game.
Yeah.
Really? They just want the attention, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that it's a different kind of economy.
Yeah.
I see.
The dating app Field spoke with adult performers, screenwriters, filmmakers, and intimacy coordinators to get to the bottom of what makes adult entertainment ethical. And this is what they found. They made a list, and I wanted to see what you think.
Yeah.
I'm curious of your thoughts, like if you agree or disagree. So the first is that language matters. One piece here is like there's gray area to that. Like, for example, slut can be reclaimed or hot to someone, but then to another person it can feel very offensive.
Yeah.
However, there's a consensus that degrading language regarding trans people or race play is off limits.
Interesting. Yes.
But you kind of shared your thoughts about this in the beginning. What do you think?
I think that this is interesting because pornography is also, you know how they say don't read the comments?
Oh, yes.
Let me tell you, in my career, I've read a lot of Pornhub comments, and I've also read a lot of papers on the nature of online platforms in general.
Comments.
So one of
entertaining.
the best papers I've ever read on Pornhub that I thought was so interesting was about Pornhub comments. It was someone who did like a discourse analysis of Pornhub comments. And they found that pretty much every other study of any, you know, comment or thread section on any platform is like, it devolves into like someone's a Nazi sooner or later. It always turns into, you know, aggression and violence and threats and like domestic terrorism before you know it. Pornhub is the exception. Where they would find that this speaks to the idea of language. There were code words that would often come up again, like slut or bitch. But when you actually read them in context, this researcher found that they were often meant to be complimentary, like this bitch is so hot.
Right.
Which I think is quite interesting contextually. And then the one other thing they noted is that whenever there were instances that were truly degrading, like if there was anything racially inflammatory said or like transphobic said, it's one of the few online spaces where users will pile on and like shout down someone who is, it's not rewarded behavior. And their takeaway, their takeaway was like, part of this is because you go to a space of sexual fantasy and, you know, the closest thing you have to a social experience on this site is these comments and you don't want it to be disrupted with bad vibes. You're out here gooning.
True.
Like, don't interrupt my session,
gooning,
bro.
it needs to be good vibes.
Yeah. Language matters, but I think you're point to the context of language is
like
very
there's the gray
important.
area.
There's this amazing scholar named Murray Miller Young, and she wrote this book called A Taste for Brown Sugar that's all about Black women's experiences in pornographic contexts. And she coins this, what she calls hoe theory, which is the idea that even the performers, when they're engaged in things like race play or if they're doing sort of like a music video girl type shoot that is maybe to, you know, some waspy observer, like this is exploitative, this is reductive, that often the people involved in the shoot will be like, no, I'm gaining my own interesting sexual pleasure and agency from this. And we do live in a society, and the fact that I can make a lot of money being an object of desire in this like high profile context, that in and of itself is deeply pleasurable. And there are all of these surprising kind of subversions of what you would think is good or bad language or representation that you can't paint it all with this one brush.
Some people get turned on by being degraded in different degrees. Not everyone has the same turn on.
Right.
And that's kind of the gray area. But what I'm wondering is like, what do you think is the hard line for language?
I would say like theoretically, I don't think there should be a hard line. But in practice, the horrible thing is that the people who get to draw that hard line are not feminist, like lesbian pornographers, it's payment processors, right? The people who are drawing the line on what can and cannot be said are not people who are invested in this as like a sapphic media experience. They're saying like fisting is not allowed because it goes against our terms of service.
Right.
Okay,
And
that
so
has
for
nothing
you,
to do with
everything-
ethical pleasure, right?
Everything is contextual then.
It is, and it so often has to do with these like economic intermediaries and political intermediaries who are not invested. They are not here for pleasure or representation. They're here for purely like economic reasons often.
You did say your work with Pornhub though, like you were working on getting rid of certain specific terms, right? So wouldn't you say like there is some kind of hard line?
So I think it's important that we de-center language that is outdated or derogatory, especially around trans people, like race, you know, terms to describe women. However, I actually would avoid using the language of hard line because then I think for every 1,000, you know, trans performers who hate hashtags that are outdated. There may be a few in there who say, no, that is my niche. Like that level of play. Sissification is my niche. Something that is a bit more harkening back to certain political tensions or like gender tensions or like a surprise that could be erotic to some people. So this is where I always am concerned about there ever being a true hard line. I would love to see some things decentered and not turned into these kind of like reductive tropes and not see them used without context. But as soon as you enter the territory of like, and that's where I draw the line when it comes to things like language.
Because I feel like you could say that personally. Like this is where I personally draw my own ethical boundary in line. Like I'm not going to engage in that, but can you make that decision for other people?
Exactly. If someone else is like, I really love transgressive race play, I'm like,
whoa, man. Yeah.
God bless.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah, I'm going to leave.
That's not for me. But I would hesitate because then I think you start to become the cops. You start to become the oppressor. You become the second wave feminists who are like, I'm all for sexual agency, except when it doesn't look like it happens between a man and a woman and God, because then it's such a moving target.
The dating landscape is riddled with alienating behaviors like mindless swiping and ghosting. It may seem inconceivable that anything else out there exists, but it does. You have options. Field, the dating app for the curious, is a space where open-minded people come to playfully explore each other and themselves. In the same way that entering a different room can bring out a different side of yourself, stepping onto Field may reveal new parts of yourself that you haven't met before. There's breathing room to explore your desires. Think relationship anarchy, cuddling, being a brat. And find communities that share your interests. Think D&D, tennis, zine making. Free from ads and completely independent, this is the space that draws curious, playful, open-minded people such as yourself. In connecting more deeply to yourself, it's possible to find your people and build the community that you've been looking for. Here's a little preview of what life is like on Field.
I used to think I was too femme to be dominant, too feminine to be anything but a woman, and too boxed in by labels that I never chose. But then I got on Field. Exploring ethical non-monogamy and kink there cracked something open in me, and I started playing with dominance and stepping into a side of myself that I had always kept at an arm's length. By the end of the year, my gender and sexuality had shifted in ways I never saw coming, and I'm not the only one. 62% of Field members evolve their desires, identities, and interests within their first year on the app. When you're in a space with no expectations, no boxes to squeeze into, you get to see what's actually yours.
So get out your phone right now, go to the App Store or Google Play and download Field. That's spelled F-E-E-L-D. Thank you, Field, for sponsoring this episode.
So many things evolve. And I think it's hard to place these benchmarks on an industry like porn.
That's like saying are movies feminist or not. That makes no sense as a question. Dangerous. Sex is inherently risky. It is inherently harmful to women. There's a bit of a response to that in understanding the way in which violence can be enacted through acts that are deemed sexual, right? It kind of endorses the idea that women don't like sex, that women are naturally not interested in sex, and that there's no kind of sexual expression that women would want to partake in except for, and that power in sex is necessarily one-to-one reproductive of power relations in the rest of the world, and that there's no opportunity to enjoy or flip or challenge or play with.
Right? Yeah. Where it's like, this is kind of where people are gooning, as you would say.
Gooning.
Yeah. One thing that would be nice, I think in general, is to go in informed.
That's the thing. I think I don't kink shame people, but I do, however, educate people on the repercussions of maybe the way that they're going about their kink, Right. When someone has presented something to me, I'm like,
please don't jump scare me with your
I'm I don't know about that.
Blood play. I'm not ready.
Okay, so the second thing is that it's going beyond cis male pleasure is one of the elements of ethical porn.
Of ethical. Oh, I see.
Ethical or feminist porn. Yeah. So Field says having performers portrayed and seen as people and agents of their own sexuality is important to counteract the male gaze. The issue with this, in my view, is that what's empowering is different for different people, right?
Yes.
It's I think, I don't know, I go back to that cover.
I hate to say it, but sometimes the male gaze expands beyond just the cis male. It's like it's more than like you could say that something is created for like the cis male gaze, but actually other people might like it too.
Adult filmmaker Erica Luss says porn has been a world dominated by a certain type of man, the white heterosexual cis man. It's his vision of pleasure that we have seen.
One thing is going beyond, I would say, like cis male tropes is something that we're definitely seeing more and more of now.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing wrong with cis men watching porn and taking pleasure from it. Get yours, boys. Get it. The problem is that when it's like framed in an exclusive way, right? And I think so often queer people have been forced to reinterpret straight media to gain pleasure from it. And the idea that it's no longer such an uphill battle is great. But like the way that the porn industry looks today, for example, is no longer this like centralized studio system where there's house styles, right? It's a creator economy. It's individual people working mostly out of their own homes who cater to a very particular kind of aesthetics and tastes, right? So it means that when it comes to the type of content they're serving, it often is, it's so much more bespoke. It's like, what does that individual person want to be doing? And what they want to be doing is another question of authenticity, because what they want to be doing is what optimizes their view counts and their incomes, right?
It brings up another question for me, which is like, how do you define cis male gaze and pleasure now, today? Like, I feel like it was easy to define before, especially, you know, when you look back, you're like, oh yeah, that was made for men or like whatever. But like now, what if you made something like super wholesome and lesbian and like very like female centered and sapphic forward, and then, but you know, like straight men are watching.
Yeah,
and they're really loving it. It's like, then is that also cis male gaze? You know what I mean?
It's the great British Bake Off, the cis male gaze.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
I feel like you can feel when something is made
See,
for
but
women.
that's going back to like what you said
the
about
Justice
like
Potter Stewart.
Yeah,
I know it when I see it.
I'll know
right?
it when I see it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess
Am I the cop?
kill the cis male inside of each of us. Yeah.
Moving on to the next pieces. I'm gonna hit you all with them quickly, and then we'll do like a big thoughts. But the last three are one, intentional casting. So they want to see more diverse people, like hiring diverse models, allowing them to show up actually as their authentic selves and not stereotypes, and ensuring performers are like fully informed about their scenes, what it will entail, their yes and no list, these kinds of things. And then like on top of that is an intimacy coordinator on set. So it's like being the intermediary between the cast and the crew, and making sure people feel comfortable along the whole way. And like the last piece is media literacy. So it's kind of like in our hands as the viewer of like deciding if something is ethical and like how you want to engage with something, right? So research the company producing the video and see if it matches your ethics and values, how the creators are being paid, like what the rules of consent are, like these kinds of things. Because I think like we were saying is like, especially what Val was saying is like, you can't always tell if someone is truly enjoying themselves or not, you know? Like, is it the scene? But like what you can tell is through a company's values and like how they're producing something, right?
You do have really successful like Lust productions, obviously, Erica Luss. Arguably adhering to this kind of like more feminist porn media making model. But the vast majority is just individuals, right? And so if you're an individual content creator and you're DMing another content creator saying, let's team up and make content, some of these things are just out of scope. You wouldn't have an intimacy coordinator if you're with adult performers who are like negotiating a scene. One of the other things is just like the nature of the industry has changed so that a lot of the bulk of the content that porn producers are making is not pornographic. Like it.
Also, I do feel like when it's like in your own hands and you have agency over what you want to make, some people go even more extreme than any studio would have gone. Like there was, I think it was Bonnie Blue who did like
ran the train
100 guys in a day or something like that. It was insane, and most studios would have never done that. Yeah.
That's on choice feminism right there.
Right. Making choice. Like she recognizes that it's the attention economy and she got attention, right?
Yeah.
But like, I guess a lot of the things that make feminist porn shift when you move from a studio model with a whole bunch of people involved in a production below the line to kind of this more in-house content creator model that we see nowadays.
So I wanted to bring us back after that discussion kind of about like what feminist porn is, because this is what the On Our Backs team was sort of like founding and creating. They were doing like BDSM scenes, like different dynamics that maybe other feminists of the time would have been opposed to. So you even see the gray area existing then too. On Our Backs followed a very Playboy-esque format with centerfold and cover girls that featured punks, strippers, dykes, and bulldaggers. The magazine got 3 types of responses for their very first centerfold spread, which was of dyke Honey Lee Cottrell, who was also like a big contributor to the magazine. So the first was they received documented evidence of a lesbian getting off to lesbian-made erotica.
Documented.
One of them sent a picture of herself from Texas masturbating to the centerfold. I was like, oh my God, you hit a bullseye. That is awesome. This is the first time we have documented evidence of a lesbian getting off to lesbian-made porn. This is so excellent.
The next was there were women who wrote them saying it was disgusting.
We had women who wrote us and said, this is disgusting. Don't you know what a beautiful woman looks like? Would you like me to send you a copy of Penthouse? These disgusting butches, they're gross. I never want to see this again, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, interesting. It just goes to show I told you that women were getting off on men's pornography all this time.
And
Clock it.
And this does show to me that some queer viewers were finding usable fantasies and pleasure and identity in adult media that was made by cis men. So I think this does kind of like bring back the conversation we were having of like the need for authenticity.
Are my desires problematic or not? Fantasies and desires are not all aspirational. They don't all we don't just desire things that we want to enact in the real world or wish to have enacted in certain ways. And the reasons to be aroused by things are much more complex than like, I think this is good, I think this is bad, I think we need to allow for a lot more like ambiguity and nuance and complexity and unclear origins and outcomes of the kinds of fantasies and aesthetics that we find sexually arousing. Maybe some of those early lesbians only looked at Penthouse because that's all they had, right? And maybe some of them just love thinking about those fingernails,
One thing I'm realizing is that the male gaze goes beyond males.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like some people, it just depends on
Sometimes
the way
it's
you're
just a gaze.
Sometimes it's the gays.
Sometimes it's the gaze, yeah.
One thing I'm even thinking of is the way that heated rivalry is like gay men, but it was created by bisexual women.
And the women are going crazy for it.
Yeah, but so are gay men too.
Sure, for sure. But the women, though, I think are going crazier.
Yeah.
They're like,
Yeah. And
you know that one. You're very Gen Alpha. Yeah. Number 3, I think you guys are maybe going to get a kick out of this.
I would say this was the classic feminist movement reaction. Dear On Our Backs, I do not know how to feel about your centerfold. What if she is not a good person? I do not know her politics. I cannot decide whether I should attempt to jill off to this picture when I do not know where she stands on ecology, race relations, veganism. I was like, we have our work cut out for us.
now that is classic. That is classic feminist woman.
Can you
right
get off
there.
on someone if you don't know? What
I know that's how my desire works. I think great politics.
Yeah,
I do think it is. I do think it is like obviously a huge desire killer if someone does something you think is reprehensible.
100%.
Oh, for sure. But
sure that's not true.
But that's
for
why
everyone,
I don't want to know.
Yeah.
I don't want to know.
I think that's why so many leftists are like really into Hassan Piker, though. Like I was saying, is like he's like a leftist sex symbol because everyone's like the politics and the body and the face.
Also, the context in which you're interacting with like a centerfold or a video performer.
There's a lot of imagination that's having
So
to
much
happen versus
imagination,
video
yeah.
porn where you're
Yeah.
just watching the specific scene. It's like for that, I don't need to know your politics. But if I'm
Yes, that's what I'm
fantasizing
saying.
about you as a person, I do like I
Then
need something to build
I
on.
would,
Yeah.
I would imagine you a very good person.
Yeah. What's
Yeah.
our life together?
Yeah. We need some lore. Yeah. We need a character and some political motivations
For sure.
for this like full spread.
I think what's kind of interesting though here is like the magazine was very political. So it's like you could assume that this person who's featured in the political magazine is also
Like
aligned with
cosigns
leftists.
a little- yeah, a little
cosigns.
bit, yeah.
But they featured an array of groundbreaking and controversial erotic writing. They often explored social and political issues around lesbian sex, gender, and relationships, with notable writers like Joan Nestle, Honey Lee Cottrell, Nan Kinney, and many more. Joan Nestle was really big. She's the one who founded the Lesbian Herstory Archives. But here is another quote from Susie Bright. She had a lot of really great things to say.
We articulated the idea of butch and femme as a uniquely lesbian rebuke to conventional heterosexuality. You just anything you thought about gender, we were like, why? We disagree. We have something else to say. We celebrated women's cunts and we called them cunts. We said people know nothing about women's genitalia, including, sadly, most tragically, women themselves. When I worked at Good Vibes, I had this saying that became part of my first column for On Our Backs, where I said, I never met a man who said he didn't know where his dick was and he didn't know how to have an orgasm. If you don't understand what that means about gender equality and self-possession and self-determination, then you have not grasped what women contend with.
Which I think is like very powerful at the time. Like they were very much fighting for women's sexuality and sex education.
Right to orgasm.
Like the right way to have sex as a woman or like to have queer sex depicted is that it has to be ideal. It has to be good. I think that arguably the other position is just to say sex in general, there should be more of it. It should be less like clandestine. It should be something we can talk about and engage with in ways that are more open-ended. Like there should just be generally more. Flood the market.
Flood the market.
Yeah. And then that takes a lot of the pressure off the idea that there are these subsets of people, queer women or trans people, who have to do perfect representation. And then you get to experience the same liberation that like cis straight men with their cis straight gazes do, which is like they're allowed to have diversity. They're allowed to have flaw, and they're presumed to not all be a monolith. You presume that it can look a lot of different ways, whereas we don't give the same benefit of the doubt to marginalized people. We get the model minority problem. We're like, okay, lesbian porn has to be good. It has to be great lesbian porn. We can't just have like kind of mid sloppy 90s lesbian porn. I say more mid sloppy 90s lesbian porn.
Yeah. So while On Our Backs is often credited as the first lesbian adult magazine, two others actually launched simultaneously in 1984. The other magazine that launched was Bad Attitude in Boston. That's the one that Glad Day Bookstore got in trouble for having on their shelf.
Yeah.
And Outrageous Women in Somerville, Massachusetts.
Massachusetts? You have a hard time saying that every time. Massive two shits.
It's a hard one.
Yeah.
Massive douche.
Yes. That's what's going to demonetize this video.
I fucking nailed it. On Our Backs did impressively run for over 20 years, which is an incredible feat considering how systematically difficult it was for them.
For lesbians, it was no. It was no, no, no. You are female. You are what? You're some little dyke. I mean, people at the time, you always was like, is this just our imagination? No, it wasn't. We would go to the bank. We've tried to get fire insurance for the office. They said, no, the nature of your business. You cannot have insurance. You cannot have a bank account. You can't have a credit card. You aren't allowed here. We're going to arrest you. We have arrested you.
So it's like there was so many things that were standing in their way.
Look around you. You're in jail.
You're arrested.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like this was happening to them. Like they were being surveilled by so many people that were being arrested. Like the nature of their business was very much, even like there was so much gray area with obscenity laws, right? It's like this was allowed, but then what would pull people back is like, now I have to go fight and interact with the criminal justice system to be able to allow myself to keep going.
Yeah.
Right?
You know, we had a bit of a tough time, and as Tristan's describing, the people who would participate in such a magazine, you have to understand, being that we were oriented towards the adventurous lesbian, the big deal wasn't getting people to take their pants off. It was seeing their faces. There was, even though a lot of gay men were very public about their, you know, this is my name, this is my face, I'm in business, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm employed here. For gay women,
I feel like that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, like there's higher standards as well for women of like not being able to be a sexual being, you know?
It's still baseline, it's punishable, whereas it's a powerful position for men to occupy. Being brazenly sexual is still kind of considered
more taboo, I would say. I mean,
Yeah,
for gay
when
men,
they're
it was
still
still
punished for it.
difficult. Like, I don't want to diminish that either. I think they still were having to create their own like sexual networks of everything to be able to do this. I just think there was certain elements in society that made it slightly easier for them.
Yeah.
Right? Well, it was still difficult. And I will say gay men helped on our backs. Like they helped lots of other
that's nice.
lesbian publications. They showed them where to get it printed, like where they can do things, where they can distribute them. And like while a lot of feminist bookstores wouldn't show their magazine at all because they were like not into them, gay men's bookstores would.
Community.
Yeah. So
perverts rise up.
Okay, so next we have the introduction to video. As video production became more accessible, the team behind On Our Backs launched Fatale Video 1 year later in 1985. It was the first lesbian adult video company, although Tigris Productions emerged the same year again in California. And lesbian audiences were very hungry for something that mainstream girl-on-girl porn was not showing them, and that was like authenticity. And this is kind of where the idea of featuring real couples and like allowing them to lead is like they were trying to figure out how to make it as authentic as possible.
Right.
I was really shocked to hear that On Our Backs was so like popular, and same with Fatale Video, but they lost money over their 20-year run. And here's Susie again. She said,
Brenda told me that somebody is doing some kind of research where they're looking at our bookkeeping, which I think is hilarious. Oh my God. You know, just, watch us go bankrupt. Yeah.
How did they lose money if they were so popular and ran for 20 years?
it was like I was saying, I think it was the criminalization mainly. Like, you're getting so many legal fees, you're losing a lot of money. Like, if your magazines, like these glossy paper print magazines that costed so much to print, they get seized at the border, you're out of money. Or the bookstore that has been showing your magazines gets charged the way Glad Day did, and he's out $100,000.
Yeah.
Suddenly they're out of business and they're writing off their debt to you because they don't have any money either. You know, like, everyone's in this difficult game where they're kind of doing it for the love of the game, I would say, right?
Yeah, I think that's also
Quite costly.
the paradox of producing ethical media.
Yeah.
Is that you're not then going for the lowest common denominator. You're not cost cutting. You're making sure that photographers and editors and contributors are all being paid appropriately. You're putting the work into research. You're putting work into like who is permitted to advertise in the magazine. Maybe no advertisers. I don't know what their precise model was, but it often means that you're working with very different margins. Whereas if you're more of a generalist and you have no problem producing just slop and pandering.
Yeah. And just creating what's like doing numbers, right? You're not thinking about it.
Yeah, so like it's a niche, especially at the time, it was a niche media market. And then they're also trying to, it sounds like, do it right from the ground up.
Yeah.
And that's not generally incredibly profitable when it comes to brick and mortar businesses and like print media, which sucks. I'm not surprised that it became more difficult to maintain that kind of profit model, around Web 2.0, because then at that point, people who are seeking lesbian erotica, they are suddenly much more likely to move online.
Yeah.
In the same way that what made On Our Backs possible was this democratization of like magazine layout technologies and softwares, then like the domestic computer and the ability to, go to some sort of porn aggregator site. And I'm not even talking like the YouPorn, Pornhub stuff of today. I'm talking like clip art and thumbnail art and message boards. That becomes so much more accessible. So people are going online at that point.
Maybe it's just like our attention, the way like our brain cells are working now with like how fast videos hit our face. I don't know, like desensitizes you a bit.
Perhaps.
Whereas if you show a Victorian child a porn
also
video.
they're
I'd love to show a Victorian child.
Yeah.
Wow. Love that.
That's it. They're coming for me now. That was my cancel moment. Not my hypothetical Victorian child.
Yeah.
You know, so as a porn researcher, I actually do get the question a lot.
About a Victorian child.
About Victorian child. Of like, you know, people will be like, so does this change porn for, like, is porn even fun anymore? If this is your job, especially when I was first getting into it, there was a lot of concern over like,
are you going to enjoy watching porn?
There's so much exposure to constant pornography.
Right.
And to be honest, like the porn that I study, the infrastructures that I study are, we're talking like major streaming sites like Pornhub, where you're seeing very particular types of media formats.
Right.
The porn that I think is fun and interesting is actually print media pornography from like the 70s, 80s, 90s, even kind of contemporary stuff. But that's like often hand-drawn. I love drawn porn. Yeah. I love what artists can come up with because it sort of pushes the boundaries of what's even possible. And I think
like hentai type stuff.
There's some stuff
or you mean vintage.
Well, some of it's vintage. There's Amoerotica and Eros were two big publishers. Funny enough, just yesterday I went to the Toronto Public Library branch, the Lillian H. Smith branch, which is the one at College and Spadina. Yeah. And they have a special collection in there called the Merrill Collection of Science Fiction and Fantasy. Cool. It's huge. But they have a work that I was reading just yesterday by Alan Moore, the author of Watchmen, the comic. He produced a work called Lost Girls. And it's about 3 female protagonists based on kind of like archetype folktale stuff of like Wendy Darling from Peter Pan and Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz and
very
Alice from Alice in Wonderland. But the 3 of them are, it's like very sapphic. Yeah. And it's all about them telling their stories of what's brought them there today and their desire for other women.
That's so cool.
But it is also quintessentially written by Alan Moore, like the guy who authored Watchmen and I believe like 300. Like we're talking
like really masculine films.
Often. Often we're looking at someone who's sort of most noted for his extremely masculinist works. And this is this very pornographic, very beautiful, very femme-coded. The entire thing is drawn in like pencil colors with these like soft watercolor tones. And it's so good.
At the beginning of the episode, I shared that trans adult content by trans people didn't begin to be created until the mid like 2000s to 2010s. Yes. However, before then, who do you think empowered trans folks to create the type of porn they wanted to make?
Was it like, ironically, like cis straight males or?
It's lesbians. Come on now.
Okay.
To me, that was
I
obvious.
just thought you were going to give me like a jump scare. And I was like,
no,
whoa.
That would be fun. Photographer Tristan Taramino was the first person to feature a trans woman in On Our Backs. However, when it came to trans men, there was some internal conflict. Here's a quote from Tristan who said,
all the people who came to me who wanted to pose in the magazine, one of them was genderqueer or transgender. And I was like, oh, this is great, we'll do this. And then Heather was like, wait, hold on, that's now a man. We're not making a magazine for men or by men or with men.
So I think this is kind of interesting because we see this conversation going on in the queer community today. It's like what's included in lesbian. And I think this is kind of why we shifted towards the sapphic label.
I see, I like talk to students about this sometimes. I have like really serious time blindness, ADHD. Yeah. So I'm not allowed to be on TikTok personally, which is why I'm always asking for secondhand information about TikTok.
It's like, why? Because like 5 hours go by and
truly, like the sun has come up and I'm like,
holy shit.
But I will often ask students, you know, when we get to modules where we're talking about the history of lesbian representation, I'll say, okay, my lesbians in the room, who's on TikTok? Yeah. And I'll ask them to describe what their feeds look like, what kind of language is being used. And it is so siloed. Like it's so specific. There's a million different permutations of what it looks like today. For sure. Which is also interesting to see how, depending on what specific kind of subcultures.
What have you seen come up? Do you remember any?
I remember about a year ago, I had one student talking about how being a gold star lesbian was like a huge factor in her online experience where like just having absolutely nothing to do with even a twinkle of a straight phase was strangely important in her online community at the time.
And now there's a consensus that that's problematic to say, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. But like you see these kind of waves of cultural relevance coming and going. And I think like when it comes to lesbian acceptance of trans representation, that's such a complicated legacy, right?
Our take is like lesbian history is trans history.
Yes.
So much of it is like before that language even existed of transitioning really is like there was like butch and like bulldagger identities, you know what I mean? That really like cross boundaries, and it's like it's hard to say what these people's gender identities would have been,
right?
You know, so it's like so many people who built this legacy of the lesbian community, like some of them might have been trans men. You never know. Do you know what was happening in the 2000s to 2010s that would have allowed trans creators to be able to like start taking control?
So in the same way, echoing the On Our Backs conditions that let On Our Backs and the other two publications arise right in 1984. Around 2005, we had the conditions that created platforms.
Right.
We already had online porn had kind of already had its explosive moment. Web 2.0 was full of female webmasters. We had people like
webmasters.
Yeah,
I like that.
Absolutely, we're going online tonight, folks. Like we would have these, you know, really interesting female pornographers who would also develop the technical skills to run their own servers, to host their own websites, to distribute their own content.
Right.
And porn is really closely tied in with the history of developing things like monetizing the internet, payment processing technology, streaming technology. A lot of it had to do with developers chasing the monetization potential of adult content, right? Yeah. And of it like being field tested effectively in adult content creation. And then all of a sudden we move into the platform era. And like for listeners who haven't really ever run into this before, platforms are not the same thing as websites. You know, you can think about websites as like a form of broadcast media. A website is a TV network. A website is the WB. Okay. A platform is an open space where the owners of the platform are not like the WB where they have this vertically integrated production studio and they're producing it all. They're just creating a space. They've created an open marketplace that then gets slotted in with users. And those users can be just consumers, they can be just producers. Often it's kind of a hybrid of both. But in the world of
Pornhub is a platform,
absolutely,
for example.
Absolutely.
The same way that Instagram is a platform.
Yeah, there's not like a corporate Pornhub boardroom where they're like, how are we making things move in these ways? They sort of open the floor to users who are producing the content and they say, we're interested in the patterns of user behavior around the content. We just give you a space to host it and you can monetize it and we like skim off the top or, you know, below the line as the case may be. And so the media model totally changed. But that was the space that gave trans creators, just like any indie creators, just like, you know, lesbian creators and people who are into particular niche kink or whatever. It suddenly meant that they, without going through a studio or a distributor, they could just connect with millions potentially of audience members and have their content be put right in front of them. You get a lot of content creators who toil endlessly and have a very difficult time ever breaking kind of through the visibility thresholds that you need to really make bank in this world. But it created this space, this potential to anyone could, if they had a, you know, a phone camera and like some basic editing software, they could suddenly be sky's the limit in terms of their visibility and their earnings. Right. And so that was because of the platforms.
Work the platform and work the algorithm, then you could be potentially very successful. So it takes more than one skill, essentially, to really make it.
And in porn, it means that you can't just really put all your eggs in one basket either. They often will have, you know, presence on subscription sites, streaming sites in order to funnel traffic, like sort of a digital billboard that it works for them. They'll have presence across a whole bunch of social media sites. They have to build audiences. And one of the reasons that they have to distribute all of these efforts is because adult sites, but also like non-adult sites, mainstream social media sites, and how they treat adult content, the rules are constantly changing without warning in ways that can really dramatically shift things like compensation. You can have a following that you've built up over 7 years, you know, millions of followers, like a very healthy income, and then have the actual platform go under quite quickly. Or, you know, a famous case of this was when Bella Thorne, the Disney child star, launched on made $1 million in 24 hours. The fallout from that was she had teased a custom like photo that was going to be released that was supposed to be a nude.
Yeah.
And it was like a tasteful lingerie shot, but that meant that she had lied, like had sort of violated the terms. And there were so many chargebacks from disgruntled customers that it ended up costing a lot in processing fees to the platform, which is their justification behind immediately. It kind of ruined it for everyone else because then they immediately said, we're going to put caps on how much can be charged for an individual photo. We're going to have hold periods for when you actually get compensated so that we don't get dinged by chargebacks outside of our system. And it really, if you're someone who for years your income has been based on a very particular model that you're comfortable with, and then you wake up one day and it's totally changed. But unlike traditional jobs, where you might have like a union or some sort of recourse or some sort of employment law to protect you. There's no employment law that really protects content creation because it's sort of in this liminal space of employment. And so porn creators have to learn to be always 6 steps ahead, right? They're always trying to future-proof their work. They're making sure that they have backup accounts on backup accounts. They're working on a dozen different platforms. They are strategic. But it means that it's a lot of work. It also means that it's not one size fits all anymore. And it created space for trans creators doing niche stuff and reaching audiences. It totally changed the math on that.
And I think what's interesting is you have a mix of people creating things that maybe we'd put in like the ethical box, like maybe the definition of what the on our backs feminist kind of porn is. Like there's someone named Hill Mayer who creates porn with like the vision of wanting young trans viewers to encounter adult content that does not make them feel monstrous or medically bizarre. But you also spoke about how the fact like there's other trans creators that are digging into sissification and making their money off of it. You know what I mean? It's like that's their niche. So it's like this democratization of the platform allows people to really do whatever they want, and you kind of have a mix of both going on where you have some creators that are doing some really cool things and like changing the scene, but at the end of the day it's like it's choice, right? And
it's a job, right? It's not a job that we would recognize under conventional employment standards, but like neither is a lot of this creator economy stuff. Neither is journalism today is unrecognizable, you know, like being a video producer today is unrecognizable as to what it would have been in 2002, and porn is no different. It is a lot of weird, soft and interpersonal and social skills, plus a lot of tech skills, plus a lot of like predicting directions that media trends are moving in. It's a lot of work. The cognitive load. Pay for your porn. Like, subscribe to your favorite adult creator because they're working hard.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful place to leave it.
Before we wrap it up, is there anything that interests you in plugging?
I just would encourage people to have more conversations about things in porn that are like technical, that have to do with representation, that have to do with like labor, that have to do with all manner of things that I know that they're thinking about because they're talking to me about them all the time, but not talking to each other. And it's not about having the perfect take. It's about having a saturation of takes and making this something that is a normal thing to talk about and to question and to reconfigure. I guess one thing I'd plug is I have a YouTube video. If you're interested in thinking about how platforms work, I direct people to that because it's like a quick, here's how porn platforms work primer. Check out the Porn Studies Journal. For anyone who is interested in porn research writ large, the Porn Studies Journal is, it was founded in 2014, and it's the spiritual home for porn research worldwide. You get everything from like very technical papers to kind of more abstract historical papers to interviews with, you know, niche pornographers. And I honestly think if it's something that any listeners are like, I want to know more about porn research, that's a great home. Go start there.
That's all that we have for you. And make sure you check out our 3 sponsors from today, Field, Beducated, and Tomboy X. Their links are in the description below, and it really helps out the channel if you check them out.
If you want to dive deeper into lesbian sex history, we have a whole episode on it called The Secrets and History of How Lesbians Have Sex. Make sure to like and subscribe, and if you're listening on your favorite podcast app, make sure to leave us a 5-star review because it really does help the channel out. That's everything that we got, and until next time, peace.